Canadian government will press for it. They can reject it if they want to.
Or too inconvenient, maybe we can help. Town Center leasing is now open for service
This is the next
at
step.
1130 West Georgia. We service all makes and models
And then
while
maybe
you
this
wait,
will go to the
or we'll
United
deliver your
States, the
car to
last
your
step,
parking
yeah.
location and leave the keys at your office.
We've got an excellent
We'll handle your
lawyer for this,
ICBC
though.
claim and provide you with an air-conditioned 1985 General Motors product while we're repairing your car. Town Center for service at 1130 West Georgia.
Good morning. We live in a very imperfect society. Also in the United States, they do the same. And in a jail in New Jersey is serving 20 years for life, for 20 years for a murder he probably did not commit. Is a young Canadian from Halifax called Bruce Curtis. And the legal proceedings around Curtis would make the average Canadian's hair stand on end. I'm led to believe by Jennifer Wade from Halifax, Nova Scotia, who is in here to whip up sympathy and money for the Bruce Curtis Defence Fund. Also in the studio this morning on a nice jolly topic is Dr. Scott Wallace from Victoria, a man who holds strong opinions on many things medical. And we're going to discuss this morning particularly a Law Reform Commission report on euthanasia, the aiding of suicide, and the cessation of treatment for terminally ill people. Scott Wallace has strong opinions on the right to die at the time of your choice with some dignity and peace and quiet. And then, perhaps on the lighter side of our affairs, we're going to dig up some bones in Stanley Park. Or I should say Richard Steele, an independent candidate for Parks Board with a $100 budget, is going to dig up some bones. Steve?
Jack, that's Dead Man's Island, the home of HMCS Discovery. But did you know that not too long ago it was the home of dying and diseased hookers and dying and diseased pioneers, and it housed a place or a building called the Pest House.
On the very face of it, Richard Steele deserves to be elected if he can bring up this kind of Vancouver trivia with his archaeological expedition into the jewel and the crown of British Columbia. But also from Stanley Park is the guy who left his heart there. You may remember him being on the program before, Jim Harvey. He's my bow in the direction of independents who are trying to buck NPA. He's not really running for Parks Board after his heart attack. He's walking briskly for Parks Board. And that'll be the program, starting with the Bruce Curtis Fund and Jennifer Wade after the break. There was a very good documentary on W5 not so long ago about the kind of tragic case of Bruce Curtis, if you take it at its face value, who got 20 years, which is the most severe sentence, I think, ever given for this particular type of crime in modern New Jersey history, and he can't get parole for 10 years. And the guy who put him away was a fella called Scott Franz, and it was one of these gruesome double killings. But Jennifer Wade is out on the coast asking you to raise money for Bruce Curtis. Now, convince me, Jennifer Wade, that people who watch Webster should send money and that this really is a raw deal for Curtis and not just a case where nationalistic maudlin sentiment is trying to help a guy who deserves to do 20 years in the bucket.
Right, well, I think first of all, in the trial itself, the original trial, there was perjury on the part of the pathologist.
You can say that?
Oh, definitely so.
That's proven?
Yes, that is a proven fact. But the pathologist was acting for the prosecutor, and so for some reason this couldn't be brought up as a charge against him. Then, of course, the young boy who at first gave the police one story, the story kept changing, and then, of course, he was turned state's evidence. and plea bargained for his own sentence, and as a result interpreted a diary, which was really beyond interpretation, a diary with 3 entries in it. And we have reason to believe he was coached in this, and of course the youngster was known as a bit of a pathological liar, really.
You're now talking about
This is
Scott
Scott
Franz.
Franz, right,
Let's start
yes,
at the
let me
beginning.
make-
Where
yes.
does Bruce Curtis come from in Nova Scotia?
Bruce comes from the Annapolis Valley, from a farming family there, a very upright, rather conservative family of the valley. His father is a captain in the armed forces.
And he was a boy who kept in his own place a collection of baseball cards worth $20,000.
No, this was the father of Scott Franz, who had the baseball card collection. And where that comes into it all is when Bruce Curtis went to New Jersey to visit his friend.
Scott Franz, the guy who plea bargained against him and got off lightly,
Eventually.
was a friend of Bruce Curtis.
Right, and very opposites they were. However, Bruce was invited down to New Jersey for the Independence Day weekend, and his parents, much to their chagrin now, gave him that as a graduation present, the trip to New Jersey. When he arrived, his plane from Nova Scotia was, I think, 2 to 3 hours late, something like that, and he was met by Scott Franz and the stepfather, Al Podges, and the man was irate that this plane had been late and he had missed a baseball card deal. And that mood of being irate, or what his stepson refers to as a hyper mood, didn't diminish. In fact, it grew worse. And Bruce Curtis, who had been led to believe he was going to a home with Great Danes and a maid, etc., in New Jersey, found himself in an absolute house of horror, a house that harbored 12 guns, where family members were beaten, where the police had 200 reports on the family. Of course, the question is, why didn't Bruce then call his parents and return home? I think perhaps the explanations to this that have been given, it was a one-way ticket he had, and he was going to drive back with Scott Franz. The 2 boys were returning after a 10-day holiday together. And then too, Bruce, of his own admission, said when he got there, and events were so beyond his understanding, really, and almost he was traumatized by this kind of situation. And instead of returning, he felt he should stick by his friend, Scott Franz. And of course, from there, events got worse and worse, leading up to Scott Franz going upstairs to take a shower and having pot shots taken at him by this stepfather. And then the next day when he went to take a shower, indeed, ironically, the day the 2 boys had decided to leave for Nova Scotia and cut short a 10-day holiday to a 5-day one. And Mrs. Podges was making the boys the breakfast of their choice downstairs. And when Scott Franz went upstairs, he came back down to get the gun. The 2 boys had 2 guns with them from the night before. The pot shots had been taken the day before, and these kids were terrified. He took the gun upstairs, and when the father apparently was reaching under the bed, and I'm going by Scott Franz's first story to the police here, when the father reached under the bed for the gun, Scott Franz fired. He had said to Bruce Curtis, if you hear gunshots, grab the other gun and run. Bruce Curtis woke up, sleeping on the couch downstairs.
And at that time, when Scott Franz, the young American, went upstairs and had this confrontation with his stepfather, Podges, shots were fired and
That's
Podges
right.
was killed.
Podges was killed.
And now our Canadian, Bruce Curtis, is still downstairs,
He's
right?
still downstairs.
He's been told to grab a gun and run.
Right, he hears the shots, he grabs the gun and runs. Mrs. Podges, also in the kitchen, hears the shots. She runs towards the stairwell. Bruce Curtis runs towards the back door. They collide in a hallway, which has been shown on inquiry, a blind hallway. And then the next thing we know, Mrs. Podges is killed. The gun discharges that Bruce Curtis is carrying. Mrs. Podges is killed. The wound is a wound in the right side, and she dies of shock 7 to 10 minutes later. And the question is, was it an accident? Well, in the first place, the woman had taken a beating on behalf of the 2 boys for defending them. She's making them a breakfast of their own choice. And if anyone is going to kill someone, they don't shoot through the right hip.
Mm-hmm. So you're convinced, and the Canadian supporters and probably many Americans are convinced, that the death of their, quote, friend, the stepfather's wife, right, Mrs. Podges, Was an accident.
Was an accident, yes. Now, when I got into it, I wasn't so much concerned with whether the boy was innocent or guilty. I was concerned because of the injustice in the trial. A real redneck sort of trial in southern New Jersey, a disgrace, really, in a country that holds up the adversarial system as sacred. That was the reason I got into it. But more and more, as I've come to know the details and facts, I feel the boy has been, in the words of David Todd, the Southern News reporter, severely maligned. There's no doubt about it.
If not actually railroaded.
If not actually railroaded. I don't believe, as Mr. and Mrs. Curtis tend to say, that it's a matter of discrimination against a Canadian. I just think it's a rotten trial, period.
More with Jennifer Wade, campaigning for the Bruce Curtis Defend Fund, which address we'll give you later, after the break. It is an indisputable fact that this young Canadian from the Annapolis Valley was involved in the death of a woman in the house in which he had gone for a weekend with his friend at that time, Scott Franz. And as Jennifer Wade was telling me with some particular color, he found, instead of a gracious home for the weekend, he was living in a house of horror where the stepfather was round the bend, had a dozen guns, was beat people up as a matter of routine, where there had been 200 reports to the police. And after a particular panic, when the other guy, Scott Franz, went upstairs and there was firing and the stepfather, the wicked stepfather, was killed, he bumps into the mother, the wife downstairs, the shot goes off, and she's dead. Now, these are the basic facts, right?
These are the basic facts, but there's something worse to come. The way these two youngsters react. Now, they've got two dead bodies in the house, both of them about 18 years of age, these two boys. Then they start to clean up this mess, and they flee. The idea of the flight is to go to visit Scott Franz's sister in Texas. In Bruce's own words, and in keeping with his Annapolis Valley background, he wanted to go and explain to the family himself he felt very responsible for the death of this lady. So they set off for Texas to talk to Scott Franz's older sister and to get help. But the worst part, and the part that people have the hardest time coming to terms with, is this cleaning up of the mess and packing the bodies into the van and then dumping them in a ravine in Pennsylvania. Now, the psychiatrist who interviewed Bruce, Dr. Harry Brunt in New Jersey, said he's not at all surprised. This is called panic reaction. And with two 18-year-olds, with events well beyond their ability to handle, that this is not a surprising move at all, either the cleaning up or the getting rid of the bodies. However, of course, they're picked up by the police in Texas, arrested and brought back. And Mr. Curtis, I'm in close touch with Bruce's family, Mr. Curtis has described the awful night when in the middle of the night the RCMP came to his door at his farm in Annapolis Valley and told him his son had been arrested for murder in Texas. Of course, he was quite sure something was very wrong. His son was visiting in New Jersey. But of course, that is how events transpired.
Now, we'll leave the description of the killings there. Tell me what's the horror of the system of justice as seen in this case in New Jersey?
First of all, it's an area of New Jersey where they do have a great deal of delinquency. The judge in charge of the case, known as Hard-Nosed Arnone, I believe he really felt that now he was going to lay down the law with these two boys, and that was it. Bruce didn't testify himself. Now, I know this is the biggest decision a criminal lawyer has to make, whether to get his client to testify or not. Bruce did not testify, and I think that's most unfortunate. And then in the court itself, there was a voir dire. The press in America is allowed into a voir dire, and that's not legal in Canada.
Trial within a trial.
A trial within a trial, right. And it was exposed in the newspapers. And of course, the jury wasn't sequestered at all. And this voir dire was all about this diary and the interpretation that young Scott Franz was going to put on it at the urging of the prosecutor, after they really thought the trial was all finished, actually. A weekend had come, but then this was brought up after.
But meanwhile, Scott Franz had made a deal with I was going to call him the Crown, the prosecution.
That's right. And the prosecutor is out for a win and a conviction.
But he knows, and the
unfortunately.
facts are clear, that the initiator of the shooting was Podges and Scott Francis, his stepson.
Right, that's right.
They knew that.
That's right.
And they knew that the other one had taken down, they knew the broad circumstances.
And 90 minutes of Bruce's trial was spent on describing the killing of Al Podges. I mean, Bruce was really on trial for the killing of the father upstairs. Bruce wasn't even there. This is the strange thing. 90 minutes of Bruce's trial was on the killing of Mr. Podges.
And I believe the rifle which Bruce had in his hand was so defective that when it was being tested in the court
That's
by a
right.
policeman, the safety catch came off and it virtually fired.
That's right. When the prosecutor was saying, so this is the gun you say just discharged. And at that point, a safety person had picked it up, and the thing did discharge in the courtroom.
Now, where does he stand now? He was convicted, I presume, in a superior court in New Jersey, a state court.
He was. And then he had an appeal.
And he got 20
June.
years and Scott Franz got 10 years, right?
No, they both got 20. One got the minimum for murder, one got the maximum that's ever been given for aggravated manslaughter. And I mean, really,
20 years for Franz for murder.
That's right.
Aggravated manslaughter, 20 years.
Right.
But doesn't he have a deal whereby he gets out earlier?
No, parole won't be granted to either for 10 years.
For 10 years.
For 10 years. But Scott Franz, ironically, is in an institution which is well kept up, the Yardville prison. Bruce Curtis is living in a sea of violence and managing to date, but how long he can, that's another question. The parents are
he was
concerned.
convicted in the state court. Next step.
Next step was the appeal, and the appeal was June the 6th. It was a quick 20-minute appeal into which Bruce Curtis, apparently one of the judges was actually bored by the defense, another judge was asleep or nearly asleep, and in 20 minutes that young boy's life was written off.
Is he finished now with appeals?
No, the next step is an appeal to the New Jersey Supreme Court. And we're urging people to write their MPs to try and get the Canadians to put pressure on that this will be heard in the Supreme Court, because it doesn't necessarily have to be heard.
What about external affairs? Have they exhibited any interest?
Well, not really. With a lot of pressure, they've responded, of course, and now we're going through a new government and getting the same responses that Canada cannot interfere in the American system of justice.
Well, it did in that case where, remember the guy was kidnapped across the border?
Oh, indeed, and
What
it
was
has
that case?
before, the Jaffe case.
Jaffe case.
Right, right. And the thing is, America and Canada are very touchy about interfering in the internal affairs of each other's country. But the thing is, this is a Canadian who has suffered an injustice, certainly in the trial, if not indeed in the verdict. And therefore, surely our government has to intervene when this happens.
Now, how much have you raised for the Bruce Curtis defense? Oh, does this money go to the family?
No, it goes actually to a committee, and the committee in turn is sort of allocating it where it's needed. It'll be used for the lawyer that they now have, a very fine person, very excellent person.
So it's not all bad in New Jersey. You can get good defense lawyers.
Yes, the defense lawyer is actually a New Yorker, but a very brilliant young man and very committed to the case.
You'll
which
need
is important.
$100,000 for this.
I should think. The family has spent $70,000 now. We've got about, when I left Nova Scotia 3 weeks ago, we had about $6,000 to $8,000 in the fund. But we would certainly appreciate any contributions. The $2 contributions add up.
I think we've got the address up or coming up, have we? Let's see it. Bruce Curtis Defence Fund, Post Office Box 1396, Middleton, Nova Scotia, BOS 1PO.
That's it.
Jennifer Wade, are you specifically involved in this case only, or were you interested in, say, Amnesty International or something?
No, I'm well known in Amnesty
Yeah.
circles in the East, but this has nothing to do with Amnesty, and there's been a bit of confusion. I got interested in the case because of the tremendous injustice in the trial alone. And I suppose Bruce Curtis is the age that my own son is, and I felt very deeply about it all.
Well, it certainly seems he's had a raw deal in procedures and in the dickering by the prosecutor to drop him in the soup as the more evil of the two, kind of Leopold and Loeb case, which it was not, was it?
Right. Not at all. No, and you're absolutely right.
Okay, Bruce Curtis, spending 20 years after dreadful 20 minutes in a house of horror in New Jersey. My thanks to Jennifer Wade. We'll repeat the address later if you want to send money. And I'll be back with Scott Wallace on Dying with Dignity after the break. This is not going to be the cheeriest program that you've ever seen in the Webster program, but every now and again you got to face up to the facts of life and the facts of death. And I've had, as everyone has, an interest in dying with dignity. And I knew the Law Reform Commission had put out a report on euthanasia, aiding suicide and cessation of treatment. And as I recall, the recommendations were kind of woolly to say the least. But on euthanasia, they define it in the Law Reform Commission, and they say this: a country like Canada could not, without violating its social traditions and history, tolerate and give a legal veneer to a policy of active euthanasia and not even voluntary euthanasia. Well, grown-up people know there are times to die and there are times to fight. And so I asked Scott Wallace, who's been an outspoken advocate of modernizing, shall I say, medical ethics and individual freedom and the right to die.
Oh yeah, I strongly believe that.
You strongly believe that. Well, let's look at it quite cold-bloodedly, and let's talk about, are we going to call this a discussion between you and me, first of all, on euthanasia?
No, it's a wider field than that, Jack, because euthanasia, I think, has come to mean a very specific single act of somebody putting a needle into a person and killing them in a matter of minutes or seconds. Whereas, if you look at it realistically, because we're talking about the process of dying, it's much more vague than that. Euthanasia, the definition, is the first big problem, because I've told you what people see as active euthanasia. Other people talk about passive euthanasia, meaning that you don't give all the treatment that would keep the person alive.
Well,
so that in a passive way you're withholding treatment, but the area is so broad and vague that I think we should get clear right at the beginning that when we talk about dying with dignity and about euthanasia, we're talking about the whole broad area from the time the person becomes terminally ill.
What makes you campaign in public for such a, it's not necessarily a depressing subject, but for such a sober and serious subject, because we all eventually face death?
Well, first of all, I'm really not campaigning, and I don't want to appear, and I have no intention of saying that I'm some kind of crusader.
No, I didn't mean
not that
campaigning.
at all. I'm just saying that the time has come for the public in Canada to be made more aware of the impact of technology, the use of drugs, transplants, transfusions, you name it, the pace at which medical practice has changed in relation to the seriously ill patient is just as dramatic as computers or space travel or anything else. But the Law Reform Commission, in my opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think their study was done with good intentions to try and bring the public more up to date with these matters. And in point of fact, the Law Reform Commission, standing exactly still, has hardly moved an inch.
Well, where would you go? In your practical experience as a doctor of many years, what do you recommend? Have you come to a firm recommendation on how one should be allowed to die with dignity?
Exactly. I think that the first point is utter respect for the wishes of the patient. And I find this the most distressing personal element in all this, because patients often ask the doctor. I had somebody just the other day once, the way she put it was, "Why, I wish you could turn off my pacemaker," was the way she put it. And on the other hand, we have somewhere in excess of 66,000 unborn children being killed every year in the mother's womb. And the Law Reform Commission talks about euthanasia would devalue human life.
Do you think
we've got the biggest paradox in this country, that we've got federal legislation which permits killing, and here we have the Federal Law Reform Commission saying that when an elderly person in pain wants to die, somebody sets himself up as God and says, "No, we're not going to allow you to die." Now, if you don't think that's a paradox, I don't know what it is.
Don't you think that weakens your argument? When you bring in the argument of abortion, where everyone agrees at a certain stage, therapeutic abortion is killing a potentially total human life.
That's right.
Yeah, but is that not mixing up the right to die with dignity, where you are dealing with someone who may well be capable of making their own decision as against an aborted
No, that's
fetus?
my whole argument. The fetus has no say in the matter at all and gets killed. I'm talking about elderly people who've had a good life, they're in pain, they've got no future, they want to die, and the state says we can't have that kind of legislation.
All right,
it says that we just give a veneer to murder, and we're murdering unborn children every day in the week.
Well, let me put it quite bluntly to you. The one thing that most of us don't want is to be put through a major crisis by the medical profession with the best will in the world, and sit up tied into a wheelchair with a porridge dribbling down your chin for an unspecified number of years as a living vegetable, right?
Right.
But when it comes to a person deciding to die, who makes the decision? If I'm compos mentis, can I now tell you as my doctor, let me die, I want no more antibiotics, I want no resuscitation?
No, that's possible. You've picked a good example. The Law Reform Commission report is good in that respect, in that it clarifies what the phrase cessation of treatment, and it mentions that if someone is a really terminal condition, that to prolong the death process by giving them antibiotics is unjustified, and that the doctor should not be held legally responsible if in fact he does withhold antibiotics.
So therefore, we've come to a delicate stage there where the patient tells the doctor, I wish no more medical treatment.
That's right.
And the doctor can then say, write it down?
Yes.
Eh?
Yes.
But what if
I might interject, Jack, that it's not unusual nowadays for the doctor, in consultation with the relatives, and that's a very vital element in this whole argument, in consultation with the relatives and the patient, can write on the chart no resuscitation or some such phrase to make it plain that if the person develops some further complication, that you don't pull out all the stops to prolong the death process.
That can now be done?
Yes, and is being done.
I remember a fantastic explosion in Britain when that first was discovered under the
right.
National Health Plan. It said no resuscitation. All right, let's go one step further. The patient says to the doctor, okay, I know I'm dying. Kindly assist me to die painlessly and today at 1 o'clock after I've seen the family.
No,
Can that be done?
No, that cannot be done. You've moved from the grey area that I mentioned at the start of the program of passive euthanasia, where we withhold antibiotics or we don't pull out all the gadgets and machinery, but now you've asked the crucial question: if the person wants to just die today or tomorrow or the next day, by some more active intervention by the doctor.
Should that be the right of the patient?
I believe it should.
More with Scott Wallace. We're going to take your calls too after the break. Yes. What was the crucial question I asked at the end?
Well, where you crossed over beyond the passive stage and said,
doctor,
can I ask the doctor to
I want to die after I've seen the family at 1 o'clock Sunday noon, or whatever it is.
That can't be done.
That can't be done. Now, there's something I want to clear up, because I think I misunderstood you, Dr. Wallace.
Dr. Wallace, you're getting very formal, Jack.
Scott, on the mention of abortion, you are in favor of the proper legal therapeutic abortion?
Yes, I'm not opposed to abortion.
You're not opposed to it?
I'm opposed to the way it's worked out. The law is faulty, and I think in many ways the law is a facade to facilitate abortion on demand, and I'm opposed to abortion on demand, but I'm not opposed to abortion per se.
The point I'm making is that the logic of your case is that properly done abortion is legal and desirable, terminating a life, ipso facto. Properly done, legal, informed consent, termination of life for an adult should also be legal and recognized in the law.
On the request of the patient who is described legally as competent to make these decisions after being informed of their circumstances and what the future is or isn't. But that's a massive difference from the abortion situation, where there's no question of the person's life is being taken. They've no say in the matter, whatever.
I know of a particular case in the United States, fortunately, where a family has kept an elderly member, wealthy member, on life supports at $10,000 a month for years in the United States. I don't know why I mentioned that. I was going to ask you, can the family take the place of the patient in giving informed consent to switch off the machines?
Well, if you're talking about a person who is totally unconscious or incapable either of responding or of giving an opinion, that's the other big gray area at the moment. And relatives, in my experience, are very slow and understandably nervous and unhappy about having to make that decision within the context of today's law. And this is the point the Law Reform Commission makes on the cessation of treatment, is that they're trying to clarify the criminal code and make the words less ambiguous so that the doctor is protected if in collusion, if that's the word, or in cooperation with the relatives, he does turn off a machine.
So therefore, if the doctor is convinced, or the specialist or whatever, that the treatment is therapeutically useless.
That's right.
That they're merely artificially pumping heart and lungs and giving the appearance of life.
Right.
At the moment, prior to this amendment, that is legal. Is it?
Well, this is a recommendation to amend the criminal code, and if that amendment goes through, then there will be a much clearer definition of what the doctor in consultation, actually with a second doctor usually, and the relatives, will have legal protection in turning off the machines. But up until now, that's been a much grayer area, and the doctor wasn't clearly protected by the law in doing that.
And is not at this very moment clearly protected by the law.
That's right.
This amendment, if it's taken on the criminal code, the doctor shall not be required to continue useless therapeutic treatment.
That's right.
But the doctor cannot aid in ending life short of its natural course.
That's right.
That's a tough one, isn't it?
Well, as you can see just from the discussion we've had, Jack, where's that very thin line where passive withdrawal or cessation or modification of treatment moves into the area of a more active way of ending the patient's life? And one person puts it very well, not in here but somewhere else I read, that it's very difficult to distinguish between sustaining life and prolonging death. And there's, I think, a much stronger public feeling nowadays that death is sort of, you can fight it longer, or you can deny it, or you can ignore it to a greater degree because of all the technology and the fact that people are living longer, they're surviving conditions from which in your day and mine 20 years ago there would be no need to have this debate because they would die.
Well, said he with a wryly sardonic grin on his face. In January, February, in European countries and here too, pneumonia came along and was the old man's friend.
That's
because
right.
he died in peace, well, not in peace and quiet, but he died reasonably quickly with pneumonia, did you not?
That's right.
Instead of being resuscitated and finishing up in my hypothetical wheelchair with a porridge dribbling down your chin, let me give you another horror question. Does the medical profession now know for sure when a person is dead?
Well, even that's certainly more difficult than it used to be, because even when I was a student, which isn't that long ago,
Long enough.
the signs were the dilated pupil and the absence of a pulse, and in fact we used to be trained in such things as putting a little piece of cotton batting on the patient's lips to see if it moved, meaning that there was some air going in and out. You know, how crude compared with today's technology. And I gather that the really acid test nowadays is the absence of any brain activity. They talk about being brain dead. As you said a moment ago, we can keep your heart beating and we can keep the blood circulating and the lungs ventilated with machines, but technically the legal definition now seems to be brain death.
See, I don't know what's come over me this morning, but I suppose that's what they have to do. If they're going to make an organ transplant of certain organs, they must keep the body with the appearance of life to keep the organ fresh.
That's right.
Remove the organ and then switch off the machine.
But at least that has some very positive human gain to it, because you're making kidneys or corneas or whatever available to someone who's going to lead a positive, productive life with the use of these organs.
We've covered the cessation of treatment quite clearly. That is an improvement in a recommendation to a point.
And I don't want to be negative all the way, because that is one of the positive parts of that
All
report.
right, euthanasia. What is your final sum up when the Commission therefore recommends against legalizing or decriminalizing volitively active euthanasia in any form, and wants to continue to treat it as culpable homicide, which is a form of deliberate death, if not murder?
Well, one of the other...
Is that a bad recommendation?
Yes, in my opinion.
Right.
But more importantly than my opinion is that I think it's of such widespread public importance that we need some kind of, I hate to use the word referendum because we don't tend to do that in this country like they do in the States. But in the States, for example, you have propositions at voting time on environment and all kinds of issues where the person going to the voting booth can also express a public opinion on this kind of issue. And I think it's time, as it is perhaps with capital punishment, which is another form of taking life that the public are going to decide about one way or the other. I think that this merits, and in times probably long gone, that we should already have had some kind of national forum. Because one of the smug things about this report that I really take objection to, it says the Commission says it would indirectly condone murder, would be open to serious abuse, and appears to be morally unacceptable to the majority of Canadians. Now, who are they sitting in their particular slot in this argument to say that it's morally unacceptable to Canadians? I think capital punishment's morally unacceptable to me, but whether I'm in a minority or a majority has never been determined except by polling, and I'm not sure that polling is always accurate. We'll probably find that out next week when Reagan doesn't do as well as everybody says they expect him to do. So I'm just saying that...
Would be open to serious abuses on the odd occasion.
Well, I
Euthanasia.
admit, oh yes, and I'm in total agreement with the public expression of opinion by some
Good.
members of the public that that's the biggest
right,
hazard. I agree with that, Jack, but my God, we've got legislation coming out our ears which is abused every day in the world, the UIC, the welfare, all kinds of consumer control, there's all kinds of, but you don't stop writing legislation because it might be abused.
Do you want the right to tell your doctor you want to die at 1 o'clock Thursday or Sunday or whenever?
Now, we're dealing with sick people, of course. Let me hastily add something we should have made very clear before, Jack. If somebody walks into my office who's depressed, and they're obviously suffering from a treatable, curable form of depression, you're not going to...
You're making the obvious obvious, and maybe I'm stupid.
Well, sometimes you have to make the obvious.
After the break. Never even thought. Okay. Can the medical profession truly relieve pain nowadays in terminal illnesses which are going to end in death?
No, not always. That's another common myth, that we've got so many strong pills and medications that we can always relieve their pain, and I recently had a case where that just didn't apply at all. We finally piled on all kinds of intravenous morphine, but the patient was not really comfortable.
What about Bernard? What did he say?
Well, he was one of the pioneers, as you know, in heart transplants, and he made the point that anybody who claims that doctors can always relieve pain, that they either haven't had much exposure with to the problem or they lack compassion.
Go ahead from Kelowna.
Yes, Dr. Wallace. I nurse geriatric residents and long-term care residents, and I believe in the passive part of euthanasia, but I do not believe in the right to go to your doctor, like when they're in a state of illness that doesn't allow them to have the right sense of mind to say, well, doctor, I want to die. Who makes that decision? Could you make that decision?
No, never. And I've tried to make it abundantly plain, and that's why I kept repeating the word competent. The legal definition of competent is that somebody can only make that request, and it could only be acted upon when there's clear evidence of the person's competent state of mind to be aware of what they're asking, and that they're totally aware of the nature of their request. And never at any time would I, for a moment, suggest that an outside person should decide on the demise of somebody who is not in an adequate state of mind or a competent state of mind.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Dr. Scott Wallace?
Yes.
The reason my question is, and I think you may have already answered it, is this a moral hang-up in Canada? The reason I ask this question is that I had a personal experience with a old uncle of mine in England, who was age 80, and dying of cancer. And we had him at home. And we had the nurse come in every day. And one day she said to me, trot down over to the chemist shop and take this prescription for a Brompton cocktail, which I think she told me was a mixture of gin and heroin. So I trotted down to the chemist shop, and he prescribed to fill the prescription without a quiver of his eyelid, and I took it back, and this was repeatedly given to my uncle. So I asked this nurse, I said, what exactly is this? And she said, oh, it's just something to give him an easy passage. There was no hang-up, no problem. The doctor was prescribing it for him, and the old guy died peacefully and with no problem at all. Is this a moral hang-up? But I think you already answered it. By
Okay, just a moment.
No, I don't.
Tell us first about the Brompton cocktail, which is
Well, it's a
widely used in
mixture
Britain.
of alcohol and morphine, or cocaine and morphine and alcohol. It's a variable mixture. People use different combinations, but that's essentially what it is. It's some form of alcohol plus cocaine and morphine. No, I don't think there's any moral hang-up in the sense that that was passive euthanasia that the caller's talking about, where a gradually increasing dose of medication is given, which in a sense shortens the patient's life, but it's not done in the 1 o'clock Sunday afternoon attitude that you were asking about, Jack. But I think I wouldn't call it a moral hang-up. I think it's a completely understandable, valid concern.
He said heroin.
Well, I don't know. That might have been years ago when heroin was still
No, he's
used.
talking about in England. You can still prescribe heroin in England.
I'm not sure about that.
You're not.
Because,
heroin, it wasn't gin and morphine.
No, it's gin and heroin.
Yes, definitely.
yeah, well, I'm not sure what date or what year you're talking about, but many of the countries, as you know, agreed with the World Health Organization back in, I don't remember, the year 69 or something, that we would not use heroin medically because of the abuses to which it gets into the hands
I'm
of...
convinced they still prescribe and use heroin
But
in
anyway,
England.
that's really not what he's asking. Whether it's heroin or morphine or cocaine, what does it matter? That's the principle he's asking. Is it a moral hang-up to give people medications that speed their death? And I think it is somewhat of a moral concern for the value of human life, and that's totally understandable, and that's the big reason people are scared of going that next step, because it would be abused.
Thank you, sir. From Kelowna, go ahead, please.
Yes, Dr. Scott Wallace, I wonder if you'd answer a question for me, and then I'll hang up and listen to the answer. If a man was to sit down while he's hale and healthy and in his own handwriting, write an authorization to his wife, ordering her to tell the doctor to discontinue medication or disconnect a machine on her husband when she feels that he's going to be just a vegetable or whatever, will this be legal? If so, would it only apply in a case of what they consider a terminal case? In other words, when they disconnect, he's going to die immediately? Or would it be null and void if the doctor considered that under medication the man could be kept alive, but he knows in his own mind that he's going to be in the wheelchair and he's just going to be a breathing vegetable?
Okay.
Well, that's a very excellent question, because we in fact have what's called the living will, which is a term used to describe the kind of document that the caller has just outlined, where someone, and I've got all kinds of my patients who have given me that kind of outline and what's called the living will, and I have it in their chart in the office, and it's my responsibility to give the utmost respect to what that living will contains, a statement that they don't want extraordinary measures to keep them alive. The big problem, again, to get back to the legal people, is that that is not law in this country. The living will is not recognized as a legal entity. And once again, the doctor's out on a limb, because sometimes the circumstances that the callers just described are not always that clear-cut, black and white, as to what the quality of the person's life would be if you brought them back to, or if you resuscitated them. We often, not often, but sometimes find that when we resuscitate a person who's had a cardiac arrest, that while they've been arrested, they've got brain damage, and you bring them back and they can't speak, or they have some serious intellectual problem. So that while the living will is an excellent idea and it gives the doctor some kind of guideline, it is not legal in this country, and the circumstances are not always that clear-cut when the person's quality of life suddenly takes a dive.
And it should be made legal.
Oh, I think we need to debate that a lot wider again in a public forum.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack.
Morning.
I was just wondering if Dr. Wallace would comment on the ability to write up an agreement well in advance of any decisions that should be made. Say the person's unable to make the decision at the time. Does he advocate the writing up of agreements well in advance of that?
Oh, so I most certainly do, and that again is really, you're referring to what we call the living will. And I'm saying that, unfortunately, you cannot speculate or judge or guess exactly what your particular circumstances are going to be, and therefore the living will tends to be in rather general language, which legal people feel is too general to be applicable when the event happens.
So all a living will now is really, it's a
guideline.
A guideline to your trusted family physician.
That's right.
Indicating the way you want to be treated.
But it could be misleading if the patient feels that they've given direct instructions which must be followed. That's the point.
Another section of calls with Dr. Scott Wallace after the break. Dying with Dignity. Is that the name of an organization here?
Yes, there is an organization here in Vancouver, and it's not the only one by any means in the country, but it's a start in trying to spark public discussion about some of the issues and the problems that we talked about today.
Go ahead to Scott Wallace.
Good morning, Jack.
Morning.
So far the discussion has revolved around people who are terminally ill or who are sick or bedridden. Last September, the New York Times published a series of articles on elderly suicide. The fact that over twice as many people over the age of 65 are committing suicide as their comparable age group, about 24 years old. And I'd like to know what Dr. Wallace, if he's addressing that problem at all, or if anyone else is addressing that. Many of these people leave suicide notes. I can quote from one here. Dear children, we know this would be a terrible shock and embarrassment, but as we see it, it is one solution to the problem of growing old. And the New York Times has a couple pages devoted to this, where old people, they just don't have any choice. Over 1.6 million Americans, I guess, over the age of 65 had to migrate from one area of the country to another.
Okay, skip it there and we'll take it up quickly. Suicide was also looked into by the Law Reform Commission report.
Yeah, and suicide, to my astonishment, the Law Reform Commission states that suicide should remain in the criminal code as an offence, and that aiding suicide, for example, if I as the doctor choose to leave a bottle of pills by the bedside so that the patient can bring about their own demise, I am to be held criminally responsible for aiding homicide.
What would you do, and what would you do about the anti-suicide law then?
Well, I would like to have a national debate about it and to have some kind of travelling commission to
I can't
get
think of
public.
anyone in the past 10 years being charged with the attempted suicide. You can't charge somebody with suicide, they're dead.
Well,
attempted suicide has been dropped as a...
Yes, but there again, Jack, it brings the law into disrepute, because what's the point of having a law if you just say on the side to the public, well, we're not going to prosecute you even if you break the law? And they go even a step further and point out that there was an Inuit boy who, well, maybe not a boy, but a young man who helped his elderly father load the gun with which the father committed suicide, and the lawyers say, of course, he got a suspended sentence.
But he was charged.
Oh, he was charged. And
what about the English system, whereby there was a public challenge by the publication, I believe, in Scotland, of how to commit suicide?
Yes, that's right.
Is that a proper thing to be done?
I don't think so, and it flies in face of their basic recommendation that the individual should have a right to decide their own destiny. They talk about the three basic principles. You should always assume that somebody wants to live as a basic assumption. Secondly, that the individual should have the right to decide their own destiny. And thirdly, that quality of life is more important than quantity. And the strange thing is that in the case of suicide, I happen to believe that personally that they're flying in face of their own principles, and that when someone, particularly an elderly sick person, has decided the time has come, who are we to deny them the right to end their life?
Couldn't agree more. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Webster. Good morning, Dr. Scott Wallace. About a year ago, My family and I had a decision to make. My father, he had many, many clinical strokes, eventually ended up as a vegetable. And the doctor said then, this was in Victoria, the doctor said then, phoned up the family and said, no, get together and make a decision. He's getting worse, and he doesn't expect to last too long, but we can keep him alive on support system. So he asked us to get together and discuss this whole thing, and which we did. Now, some of the family said, put him on the system, but the majority overruled, and we won out, and of course my father passed away.
Well, does that kind of thing surprise you?
Oh no, that doesn't surprise me, because the minute you put people on support systems, you're giving what the Law Reform Commission describes as useless therapy or therapeutic uselessness. You're prolonging the death process. You're not sustaining life. You only sustain life and put people on support systems when it's likely that they will return to some kind of normal health, like this kid that went down the well and was at a very low body temperature, and he's a young person with healthy young tissue. That's another ball game altogether. You would always try to do something in these cases.
But in that particular case, in this particular man's family, that doctor acted ethically, properly, and not illegally.
No, not illegally.
Not illegally.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My goodness. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Dr. Wallace has answered one of my questions there regarding the living will. I feel even in case of a terrible accident that might happen to me tomorrow, which is, instead of an incurable illness that might go over a period of time, I would like to know that I would have the right to sign a form that my doctor has in his possession that would give him the right, rather than put the onus on my children, to make that decision for me and live with that guilt for the rest of their lives, that they had to make that decision when I feel that that is my right to make that decision. Thank you very much.
Well, this is another, she's perfectly correct, and the reason I keep referring to Jack to the need for some kind of national debate is that hundreds of people come to me, and I must come to each doctor. I'm no different from all the other GPs. They must hear this all the time. And I can't believe that the Law Reform Commission says that this whole subject's morally unacceptable to the majority of Canadians.
Oh, yeah.
Listen to the callers.
Let me see that again.
It's
that was a good phrase.
Down here.
Would not tolerate or give a legal veneer to a policy even of voluntary euthanasia.
Yeah.
That's nonsense. That's
and
garbage.
But this other part says that the suggestion appears to be morally unacceptable to the majority of Canadians. And I don't think the majority of Canadians have had a chance to express themselves.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please. Oh, sorry, I'm the wrong one. My mistake. Go ahead, please.
Well, good morning, Jack and Dr. Wallace. I'm totally in agreement with the thrust of your discussion this morning, particularly pointing out the incredible contradiction between the attitude toward euthanasia and the attitude toward abortion. But you emphasized just before a break that you're talking about people who are very, very ill. And if you talk about that and put that provision in, I'm presuming a committee in a hospital of doctors would be set up to make this decision. And it'd be the same ones that when we were sold and our legislators were sold on abortion, it was to the point that it would only be used if the life or health of the woman, the mother, would be endangered if they continued. Those same doctors would be making this decision, and the same ones, I suspect, would be saying, oh no, you're not sick enough, this one's not sick enough, this is not sick enough. They wouldn't be rubber stamping as they have been the abortion. I have no faith in them.
No, well, I respect that comment very much, because I'm totally in disagreement, one, with the kind of legislation we have regarding abortion and the way it is unequally implemented all across this country. It's supposed to be a national policy. The legislation was written vaguely and ambiguously, intentionally so, and I agree with the caller that if we got into legislation on the euthanasia, we would run the same risks. All I'm suggesting, as I keep repeating this, all I'm asking for is some kind of significant public debate in one way, shape, or form, so that all these elements can be looked into, and perhaps if we do get legislation on euthanasia, at least it will be more precise, more significant, and more accurately implemented than we've had with the abortion legislation.
And you'll keep at it until the day comes when informed consent of a person with a terminal illness will be recognized as legal in law, and enable the doctor not to be an offence against the criminal
Yeah,
code.
and if that happened, Jack, of course you wouldn't have to have all this committee approach and the dangers of abuse through committee approaches where either they rubber stamp them or unwisely oppose the request of the individual. Because the caller's quite right that in some areas the applicant is looked upon much more stringently by the committee, and in other places it's virtually a rubber stamp. So when you have legislation like that, it brings the whole of law into disrepute if we all know that it's poor law and it's badly implemented.
My thanks to Dr. Scott Wallace from Victoria, and I wish you well in your campaign.
Not a campaign, Jack. Just
in your desire to have a national public debate in this very sensitive and delicate forum, which can make life an awful lot more happy for as long as it lasts for an awful lot of people.
That's right.
I'll be back after the break.
Jack, that's Dead Man's Island, the home of HMCS Discovery. But did you know that not too long ago it was the home of dying and diseased hookers and dying and diseased pioneers, and it housed a place or a building called the Pest House? Well, it's still a pest for one person in Vancouver. His name's Richard Steele, and he wants to turn it back into the hands of the Parks Board. And in order to accomplish that, he's running on very little money for the Parks Board. Richard, tell me something about Dead Man's Island. What was it in the beginning?
Well, I guess it started off initially as an Indian burial ground, first of all, Steve. And when the first settlers moved into the area, they found the cedars and hemlock on the island covered with bentwood cedar boxes. And
these are these graves that these... What Indian tribe used them?
Well, this is all pretty well Coast Salish area down here. And there seemed to be a hierarchy of burial on the island. If you were one of the better-known members of the tribe, you got a tree branch, and if you were one of the lesser lights, you were under cedar slabs on the ground itself. And then from there on, the pioneers started using the island briefly as a pioneer cemetery.
Tell me about the Pest House.
That happened roughly about 1888 when smallpox was hitting the coast in one of its periodic epidemics. And basically what happened was the city needed a place to put all these people that were dying of smallpox, and they built a pest house on the island.
Hence the name Dead Man's Island?
Dead Man's Island goes back a long ways before that, and it's sort of shrouded in legend. Everybody wants to claim credence for having done that, but...
What's the definitive story?
The definitive story? Probably you'll never find out.
Yeah. And it was a home for the hookers who at one time were in the West End, but...
Well, basically, I guess some of the ladies from DuPont Street were shipped over here too. Naturally enough, they had contact with the sailors first, and unfortunately, when the smallpox came in on the boats from the Orient, the hookers picked it up as well, and they, along with the sailors and early pioneers that had smallpox, were kept here on the island in what was called the Pest House, and that was the official address: Pest House, Dead Man's Island.
It hasn't always been a nice, quiet, sedate little place that it is now. There was the scene of a ferocious battle at one time, wasn't it?
Oh, this was an ongoing battle, legal and otherwise, from about 1899 on. But basically, the city of Vancouver wanted it as part of the park, and the federal government had leased it to a lumber magnate by the name of Ludgate. And they actually fought pitched police battles that resulted in the mayor reading the riot act over there, and Ludgate and his partner being dragged off in leg irons to the local jail. So the island's seen some pretty heavy battles, legal and otherwise, and unfortunately every tree on the island was wiped out in that battle in 1911.
What do you want to see done to it now?
Well, I don't want it to go back to a pest house again, obviously, but I think it should again be part of Stanley Park. I think it would be a fantastic asset for the city of Vancouver, sitting as it does in the middle of Cole Harbour. And could you beat a view like that?
But how do you wring it out of the hands of the federal government? What is it now? What do people do on there now?
Well, of course, it's the HMCS Discovery. It's a semi-sedentary naval base. It's really more than anything else, I guess. We're a place where good old boys from the Navy sit around and have a beer and talk about the old days. It really doesn't serve any vital military function. I don't think the defense of Vancouver and the West Coast hinges on Dead Man's Island anymore.
If City Council has anything to do about it, this being a war-free zone of some description.
Right, exactly.
Okay, are you basing your campaign on that?
No, that's only a very, very minor platform in it. I think we should have it again. It was part of the Parks Board jurisdiction until the Second World War, and I think we deserve to have it back again. It definitely would be a compliment to the city and to the park as a whole.
Where we're standing right now is also what? It was a village at one time, wasn't it?
Well, as a matter of fact, we're standing on the old burial ground. This is the early pioneer burial ground right here, the first one. The village site itself started a little ways down the slope from us, but right now we're standing on Vancouver's first cemetery.
How come no one has known that before now, and why isn't it marked?
It's been known as to why it hasn't been marked, and this is one of the reasons why I'm running for the Parks Board. I think that we should have recognition of the historical sites that fall within Parks Board jurisdiction. Basically, this whole area was known to the Parks Board in the early days. There are references even as far back as the 20s. But there were no permanent tombstones or anything of that nature.
And the bodies were moved, of course.
No, never. No, we're standing right on top of them right now.
Well, there's a few ghosts in Stanley Park.
Oh, probably, yes. Stephen King would love this one. So.
Is this whole park riddled with archaeological sites, or at least bits of Vancouver's history that perhaps is forgotten?
Very much so. Very much so. The entire park really is a treasure chest of historical information for the whole Burrard Inlet area. Early Indians used it. We had two major villages not far from where we're standing right now that were early white and Indian settlements. And of course there was extensive use during the First and Second World Wars on the other side of the park too, and these are pretty well ignored.
What do you want to see the Parks Board do now then to this? I mean, you can't expect the people to pay for a bunch of bronze plaques to be plastered all over Stanley Park. Is it really an expense we want to incur right now?
I don't think really that kind of recognition is the kind of thing we're really looking at. I think it's more important to try and establish where some of the archaeological sites actually were. We do have the rough outlines for some of these, but we can't really go ahead and plan major developments in Stanley Park unless we know the exact parameters of the sites. Otherwise, we're going to be destroying a vital part of cultural history.
Tell me something about past Parks Board. Tell me the story about Lost Lagoon.
Oh, that was interesting. That one makes the Lumberman's Arch aquarium expansion look pretty tame by comparison, I suppose. About 1911, the city engaged an architect from England by the name of Mawson. And his idea for Lost Lagoon, which didn't exist as a lagoon at the time, it was just the end of Cole Harbor, was to turn it into a perfectly round, ornate little lake surrounded by marble and Grecian and Roman style colonnaded buildings. So for him, Stanley Park was just raw material to be turned into a very, very British style or European style formal park with such things as leaves and twigs not allowed. So that was his basic idea, and the Parks Board thought it was great. And the only trouble is they didn't have the money, and that's the only reason why we have what we do today, which is a fairly natural-looking park.
Are there some equally unusual ideas coming out of the Parks Board now and today?
Well, of course, I think this whole business of the aquarium expansion probably rates as a rather major mistake, but nothing maybe on the scale of what we had before.
What's there in Lumberman's Arch where they want to build that new aquarium pool? Is there something there we don't know about underground?
Well, the Lumberman's Arch area is a very, very, very well-known former Indian site, an Indian village site. It was used by the Indians before the village itself was built, which is probably in the 1850s, for several centuries. The midden or cultural deposits in that area were about 8 feet thick at the time of the first park road being built in 1888. And numerous skeletons were unearthed in 1888 from that site. So we're basically looking at an area that was used as an Indian burial ground as well. As a matter of fact, a skull was unearthed there in 1962 when the pedestrian underpass was built. So nobody really knows the exact parameters of that site. To go ahead and plan expansions without any exact archaeological data is taking a very, very severe risk of destroying a very valuable archaeological site.
Okay, thanks very much.
Good.
Maybe I was wrong when I told Joe Mathias they ain't going to get Stanley Park. But remember that name, Richard Steele. They tell me he made the best speech at the All Candidates Parks Board meeting. Ex-reporter, which makes him a decent guy. Only got $100 for his campaign, which is why we gave him a shot. And he's already spent $35 on these pictures. That's the kind of new blood we need in the Parks Board, said he in a non-partisan manner. And next we're going to meet my friend. I've only met him once when he was recovering from his heart attack, Jim Harvey, who must be happy or unhappy about the pool expansion now. After the break. Well, here is Jim Harvey, who was to be an NPA candidate, but is now a non-NPA candidate. He's an independent candidate for the Parks Board. Is that correct, Mr. Harvey?
That's correct.
I had a line which my kids took off because they thought it was too brutal, that you left your heart in Stanley Park. Yeah. Because at the time I interviewed you, you just recovered from a heart attack.
Yeah, but now I'm heartless, and I'm at least equal to the NPA candidates, but they're all heartless.
All right, let me be nice and decent and civil and all. How are you feeling?
Fine.
You feeling good?
I can jog now.
Oh, I recommend it.
The doctor, I was on the test on the treadmill yesterday, and the doctor says I can start jogging. My heart, it hasn't even got a little blip in it.
You sure they know what they're doing, these doctors?
The best.
Okay. Are you happy, Jim Harvey? All right, how unhappy are you, Jim Harvey, about the development permit people saying go ahead with the whale pool extension on the beautiful green swards of Stanley Park?
I'm unhappy that some bureaucrats who were not voted into power can dictate a position and take a year nearly to get around to it without doing proper research. Spaxman didn't even know, for example, that it was a breeding pool. It was a very flimsy conclusion, and we must have people who are accountable in office making these sort of decisions. The aquarium were not done a favor. I feel sorry for them in a way, but the Parks Board must be held accountable for that decision. It was made 15 months ago to go ahead, and this was merely a little bit of a rubber stamp. You must understand, 15 months ago, the NPA-dominated board rammed this thing through. I was not even allowed to speak. When they called for a question, I didn't know, so quickly that the vote was taken, and that was it. And that was Andy Livingston, Doug Mowat, and Bennett, and Wainburn, and Ashford.
So Spaxman has really got Harcourt off the hook for the moment, hasn't he?
Sure. And maybe even the Parks Board, because the Parks Board Commissioner can say that Spaxman and his crowd have okayed it.
Yeah, but there's another item in the wood pile. They haven't got the $2 million from the feds, without which, or the money from the province, without which they cannot build. Am I correct?
They have less than, I understand, $3.5 million. They've been fundraising since 1979. They have $1.5 million from the Max Bell Foundation included in that. They have 33,000 members. They have 5,000 people only have given little bits and pieces. So it makes you wonder just how popular is if you can't raise money for the whales, why are we needing this whale pool so much? That's a terrible performance. Now, Ottawa, as you say, John Fraser has the right to withdraw that funds. I think tomorrow or the next day is the last day. Now, he withdraws it. If Victoria then is out of it, then you have enough money to put in a seal pool, not a whale pool.
But the money isn't there. You're talking about to withdraw the commitment for the $2 million.
That's right.
The money isn't in.
No, it was a promise to put it in if Victoria matched. But do you think Bill Bennett is going to put money in a whale pool when he's trying to show the people of this province how careful he is, how disciplined the social creditors are? Nonsense. If he does, he's making a very serious political mistake.
I mean, after putting $160 million on the BC Stadium, is he going to give? Is he committed for? Is he supposed to give $2 as well?
The Ottawa $2 million offer is subject to Bennett giving $2 million. Click $4 million.
Why have you got that happy smirk on your face?
Because I'm healthy.
No,
because talking to you makes anyone happy.
No, because you think that Bennett will chicken out on the $2 million, don't you? And if Bennett
no, I think that he will be wise enough to not make the commitment. I think John Fraser, who I have the highest regard for
whom you have the highest regard,
can find a more important place for $2 million than a whale pool for whales to breed in. There are great needs in the fisheries industry where that $2 million can be used to increase fish stock and the like.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're not running for NPA for obvious reasons. They don't want you.
It seems that way.
Why didn't you run for alderman? I mean, we could do with some. So seldom you meet bright people running for alderman. Why didn't you? Because you're what, a stockbroker?
Well, first of all, the NPA, I don't think I'm so bright, so we'll have to review that one.
I see.
It means I'm probably very bright if they think that. The simple fact of the matter is I made a commitment to the parks. And there are a lot of people in this city who believe that I have a sensitivity to the parks and park needs, and have shown it by action. So I'm staying in. I don't want to be accused of being someone that tried to improve my position and use the Parks Board as a stepping stone, which has been done so often by previous MPA candidates.
After, what's wrong with spending public money to watch whales jump to eat dead herring? That's your quote, this morning's paper. You say,
I thought it was
has
yours.
the aquarium got the right to alienate Stanley Park so it can charge people to watch whales jump for dead herring?
Yeah.
That's a great quote, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so.
Now, I like this fellow. What's his name? Richard Steele.
Yeah, good fellow. He was at the meeting last night. Now, he's got another angle, and he wrote last week to Ottawa a very strong letter to George MacDonald, the head of the Museum for Man, who apparently is in charge of historical lands, Indian land area, and has stated that Stanley Park is a federal park, not provincial. So therefore, the BC Heritage Group in Victoria have no right to make a judgment as to whether a whale pool can be put in that park or not. It's a federal matter, and he is challenged.
It is a federal park.
That's right.
It's $1 a year lease, as I recall.
So his research, I mean, the citizens are lucky to have a fellow like, he goes by the name of Michael Steele.
Michael Steele.
He'll have a tough time because he's not known and he hasn't got the big NPA label all over his back.
How about you? You might have a tough time, too.
Oh, well, that doesn't matter.
Jim Harvey.
I don't worry about him. There are enough people out there, I believe, who are going to pass the word around that maybe it's a good idea to have me on there to keep a few people honest. Maybe I'll be the Rankin of the on the other side of the coin, if you know what I mean.
That'll be the idea. No, that's not good PR. Don't say that. Just say that you shall be the burr under the saddle of the pompous, stuffy establishment NPA people who want to run the pop boat again.
The two team people are good. I'm supporting George Wainburn. I'm supporting Pat Wilson of Cope, and I'm supporting Steele. I have one more slot to fill in. Those are the sort of people that can run the Parks Board for
independent-minded people.
Right, and honest people.
With no conflicts of interest with the Amalgamated Construction Association or any of that nonsense.
That's right.
My thanks to Jim Harvey.
Pleasure.
Never endorse a candidate, but don't forget Steele and Harvey for the Parks Board.
That was Harvey.
After the break. On Monday, we're going to do a live forum in our studios in Burnaby on the pros and cons of capital punishment. If you want to attend, call after the show today at 420-3336 or long distance collect 420-6444, and we'll make arrangements with you to come. Well, now this is Halloween. When I was a kid in Scotland, it was the greatest night of the year. Bonfires and, of course, from gowlies and ghosties and long-legged beasties and things that go bump in the night, good Lord deliver us. At 9 a.m. precisely.